Good morning. My name is Aldo Leon. I am the teaching elder, if you don't know that term. The senior pastor is another way you could describe it, of Pinelands Presbyterian Church in Miami, Florida. And I would like to engage this morning on the topic of Christianity in the West being hijacked by the white man. The whitewashing of Christianity. Let me just say, to start the conversation, I would agree that elements of Christianity in the West have been hijacked. You can see that by majority culture, but you can also see how Christianity has been hijacked and washed by other groups as well. So I'm not denying that. However, what I'm seeking to do is to counter the idea that Christianity holistically, comprehensively has been compromised by a white conspiracy. Let me also say that this conversation is very broad. What I mean by that is that in these groups of people that are talking about whitewashed Christianity, there's a range. I'm going to address the range. So if you are not that person in the whitewashing of Christianity conversation, then it doesn't apply to you. But understand your broader circle certainly could own some of these things. So what I want to do is be able to critique things about Western Christianity, or the Western civilization and its story of Christianity that is in it, with continuity being stressed as opposed to discontinuity. It seems like in the whitewashing of Christianity conversation, the stress is discontinuity from the Christian story in the West. I want to stress continuity while being able to critique elements of it where necessary. The reason why I want to address this is, first, I just don't think that what I am saying is very much a larger part of the conversation. I think a lot of the people that oppose whitewashed Christianity do so because they are legitimately prejudiced. And I feel like the people that advance and speak against the whitewashing of Christianity tend to be radically oversimplified and problematic in a lot of what they say. So I hope that this would be a good contribution to the conversation. Let me also say that I am not pastoring in a majority context, a majority people group. I am in the urban context, pastoring a church that is primarily made up of minorities in Miami. So let me get a little casual here. You can miss me with all that. You don't understand the urban minority context stuff. I do. And it's not just Latinos down here. It's Latinos we're doing it with also different groups in the black community as well. So I understand this. Also, let me say that this issue of whitewashing, it's not purely with some group. So you can, I've experienced this with, in the Acts 29 world, with the woke church, and now they call themselves a conscious church. I've experienced this in just Big Eva. If you don't know what that is, it's just the popular elites who represent Christianity in a very public sense. I've experienced this in my own denomination, the PCA. I've seen this in the SBC that I was a part of. I've experienced this stuff with conversations of actual people that are well known and some less known. So this is not YouTube theologizing. This is not Twitter and social media oversimplified reacting. These are worlds that I know, I've lived in, I've been a part of, and are different, obvious segments that I'm interacting with. And so you'll see some of that addressing different people. So this is going to be four parts. So I would encourage you to, if you can't sit through this entire thing in one sitting, sit through it in the 4 parts. So we're going to talk about sifting through some of the errors of the whitewashed Christianity conversation. We're going to talk about some of the inconsistencies, the duality in the conversation, part 2. Part 3 will be some of the theological deeper issues. And part 4 will be diagnosing if this movement is truly one of renewal, the way it is. So, part 1, sifting through some of the errors. Here's the first thing I would like to address. And by the way, this is not comprehensive or holistic. I'm not saying everything that could be said about this conversation. Obviously, I could say a whole lot more, but you know what? I got a life, I got a family, I got a church. Here's a part. The first one is there's a conspiracy to silence all non-white voices in the sea of church history, both now and previously. Now, let me say that, firstly, in church history, you will find periods of time, moments, where this is true. You will. But is the totality of church history from the Reformation to the present a vast sea of silencing non-white voices, simply because of the density of certain voices? Let me say this. The New Testament was written mostly by Jews. It doesn't mean that the New Testament is Jewish-washed. The first 4 centuries, most of our theologians are Mediterranean and Middle Eastern and North African. That's what they mostly were. It does not mean that in the first 4 centuries, because of the predominance of those people, that it was Mediterranean washed or North African washed. Okay? So simply because there is periods of time, centuries, where there is a density of theologians, that there is this conspiracy to make homogenous the theologian of a people group. It's not necessarily the case, even though it has been the case. It can be the case. That does not summarize the totality of church history simply when there is density of certain theologians. There was no Greco-Roman conspiracy of theologians to homogenize theology, simply because that was very much the case for a long period of time before things move. I certainly think we can do better at representing different theologians. Let me also say that, look, guys, in America, most people have European roots. So most people will very likely be a theologian of the most predominant group. If you were to go to the continent of Africa, you would probably find a density there as well. Okay, number 2, one of the errors is that the story of whites and blacks, I say quotation, is like I reject those categories as being truly representational of anthropology from a biblical standpoint. But let's just use the terms that they use. That the story of whites and blacks in America, or previous America on the way to America, is the story and the narrative of Christianity in the West. Let me say that again. The story of these 2 groups and their issues is the story of Christianity in the West. It is a narrative and a story of Christianity in the West. It is one narrative amongst many narratives, but it is not the architectonic, organizing narrative. Now, this is important because one of the things that is said in the deconstructing the whitewashed Christianity is that this narrative pretty much is the architectonic, covenantal governing principle of Christianity in the West. Let me just say this respectfully. America is not the story of white and black people. It is a story. It is a story we need to deal with. we have dealt with and we need to deal with. It is a narrative. But America is many narratives. And the story of the church is not the narrative of these two groups. It is many narratives, and that is one. I think one of the things that happens in these conversations is we take a narrative that is real, listen to what I'm saying, and we make it the narrative that governs and organizes and centralizes all as some kind of epicenter. And so, someone like Jerome Gray, who wrote the book Whitewashed Christianity, which is not, it's someone in the conversation, but not the conversation. They'll say it was a conspiracy because look, there was commentators that wrote this about minorities and yada yada yada, and because we can see it in commentaries and we can see it in here, therefore it is the narrative. That's not necessarily true. Listen, I know commentators right now in seminaries that don't believe that Moses wrote the 5 books of the Bible. Okay, I know many theologians and commentators that don't believe that John wrote the Gospel of John, that believe that Matthew and Luke borrowed from some kind of Q document. That doesn't mean that most Christians in America are dominated by that theological narrative by that commentator. So the assumption that this is something that we can see in church history assumes that it is the narrative that shapes everything is not true. In Acts, we can read about Hellenistic widows being overlooked. That is a narrative in the book of Acts. That doesn't mean that it is the narrative of the book of Acts. It organizes everything else. Number 3, the slavery Christianity narrative. Now, what I mean by that, slavery Christianity West narrative. Slavery, Christianity, and West are married in one inseparable bed. Let me say a few things about this. Were there people in the West who were Christians, who were whites, that married these things together? Yes. Yes. Was that wrong? Yes. Should we own that? Yes. Okay. But slavery is not a product of the Christian West. Okay? Slavery is a product of humanity all the way back to Genesis. And it is in continental Africa. It is centralized and predominant in places like India. Christianity and the majority European-rooted person in the West is not where slavery comes from. It is where slavery perpetuates, as it did in many people in the globe. As a matter of fact, the Christian-influenced West is the place that slavery and its legalities is diminished the most. If you go to the Muslim world, the African continent, if you go to the Middle East and the East, it is those places where the legality of slavery perpetuated in ways that has continued to this day in ways that it did not in the Christian-influenced West. So this is almost like saying that in Miami, there's a lot of Black and Latinos folks in church that are into prosperity theology. And for me to see that is for me to say that to be Latino or to be Black and to be Christian is to be necessarily covetous. Marry those things separately, okay? So let me just say this. Can you find slavery, Christianity, and majority married in church history? Yes. Can you say that the narrative of slavery and Christianity and white folk is a distinctly Christian West issue? You can't say that. It is a global issue. It is a Genesis-rooted issue. And it is fact that it is in the places where Christianity was justified by Christians, in those same places, it is where Christianity obliterated the legality of slavery in the West. Wilberforce is a good example of that. Another issue I think is in this conversation is that, guys, I don't know if you noticed, most people did not own slaves. Most Christians did not own slaves. So again, the idea that Christian and slavery are this inseparable cohabitated thing is not necessarily the story, okay? Another thing that you will find missing from this conversation is how there are many people in the church, many Reformed people in the church, that oppose the slavery narrative. You don't never hear that talked about because it has been simplified to be Christianity, white people, slavery. The RPCNA is one example of one denomination that always opposed this narrative, and they did church discipline on slave owners. So to say that Reformed Christianity and slavery is some kind of theological crockpot, it's not true. You need to say there are some people in the Reformed tradition that have bought into this owning of people that is not distinctly Western, but simply global and Adamic, that did so. But the Reformed tradition, actually, both in the continental Europe and over here in the West, that they want no parts of that. So again, that's just something that I think is missing from the conversation. Also, the other one is the education conspiracy. The education conspiracy. Now, let me say this: that there have been times when certainly the education of theology has been intentionally misdirected to avoid the totality of Christian theologians. Okay, I believe that. Okay, but this idea that in America now there is this conspiracy in seminaries to not teach people that are not European, to teach people exclusively that are European, is absolutely ridiculous. Okay, I went to many seminaries. Okay, I teach in one, I was trained in two. Okay, Master Seminary, the Southern Seminary, and now I teach for Lamp Seminary, which is a Presbyterian-made seminary. We all had to learn theology and theologians from North Africa, from the Mediterranean, from the Middle East, in the early centuries of the church. Okay, this is what I hear from some folks like Jerome that education in America about theology begins in Wittenberg is a lie. Okay, it doesn't. Maybe for some folks it does, but in seminaries we have to learn about theology that is Eastern. Okay, that is North African. As a matter of fact, my tradition from Reform, we build strongly from the Augustinian and Athanasian way of seeing the scriptures, or how they articulate the scriptures. So the education conspiracy is false. Furthermore, if you're a confessional like myself, we take vows on ancient creeds written in these other places in the United States. Next fallacy is a Reformed privilege fantasy. The idea that Reformed people, confessionally Reformed people, are those that wrote their theology from their privilege. I've heard people say this verbatim in the Acts 29 world, also in other places. Look, if you study the Reformed narrative very closely, you will find that they were actually chased by and oppressed by the people in dominant power. Now, what you'll find is with someone like Calvin and someone like Luther, who was chased around, Europe by the people in power, you will find that they were helped by people that had political clout, but they were not people of power. The Puritans in Europe were not privileged power people. They were also chased and oppressed and jailed for their convictions. Okay, so the idea that Reformed theology is a theology exclusively of privileged people, it comes from people that don't know church history. Okay, if you look very deeply in, doesn't mean that people in the Reformed world are not privileged. I think in many ways they can be, but that is not the Reformed narrative. Reformed theology was a movement from the common person, for the common person, against the hierarchy and spiritual oligarchy that was political and spiritual of the day. Those are just facts. Another thing that I think is a fallacy in this conversation of whitewashing is that Reformed believers are majority people group homogenized, okay? This is the issue of Americans that don't have international roots. And I say that as someone who is comes from immigrant family. You guys act like America is the microcosm of the entire universe all the time, for better or for worse. Leftist theologizers and rightist theologizers. Let me just say this to you. Most people that are Reformed, confession Reformed, are not white. Okay? Let me just give an example of this in the PCA. In the PCA, there are more Presbyterian churches and members in Mexico than the U.S., in Brazil than the U.S., in South Korea than the U.S. Okay, so the idea that this thing is a white people thing, you may see that in your little microcosm of your context, but in the macro of the globe, it is very much a multicultural tradition. As a matter of fact, a lot of these movements, like Acts 29, that are always talking about being multicultural, are decades, potentially centuries behind being as multicultural as the Reformed tradition is in the globe. You want to talk about, the Reform movement in Africa. Let me tell you something. In Africa, Reformed Christianity, from the English tradition, baby baptized, is massive and colossal. Larger than it is in Europe. So again, that's another fallacy that you'll see. Another fallacy in this conversation is the Eurocentrism fallacy. So if you hear a lot of these guys in the whitewashing conversation, they talk about the Eurocentric powers and narrative and whatnot. Okay, what exactly is Eurocentrism? This is also due to the fact that Americans tend to think very oversimplistically about people, color, nationalities, and areas. Europe, what Europe? You talking about Eastern Europe or Western Europe? Okay? Are you talking about Europeans that were German, or Europeans that were English, or Europeans that were Scottish, or they were Irish? Because in those groups, you will find a radical difference in their narratives and how they process anthropology and politics and everything. And even if you talk about Ireland or Scotland, are you talking about Catholic Scotland or Protestant Scotland? Okay? When you talk about the Reformation, the Reformation and Eurocentrism and whatnot, are you talking about the Swiss Reformation, the German Reformation, the Dutch Reformation? I mean, are there Europeans, okay, from certain countries that created ideological categories of supremacy at the expense of others. Yeah, that's true. And guess what? People in Africa did the same thing. That's why the people that were sold to Africa were sold from people in Africa, because they had created these categorical distinctions of supremacy. So yes, people in Europe do that, but the idea that it is this massive abyss of Euro, that's not actually how the world is. That's not actually how geopolitics are. That's not actually how Europe is. Same thing with a lot of like the whitewashing conversation. When they talk about America, they talk about the black and brown community. What is the brown community? Because if you actually talk about the brown community, which is, I guess, the term for Latinos, guess what? We're not brown. We're brown. We're black and we're pale. Okay? Number two, are you talking about Mexicans from the north or Mexicans from the south? Are you talking about Cubans who come from a communist country, or are you talking about Argentinians? What is this brown thing that we are oversimplified by? Well, so again, I think this oversimplification of Euros and brown or black, I think is just a very confused argument. And here's the last. I got two more thoughts about some of the inconsistencies. Is the thing that oftentimes is said in these conversations is that America's roots are not related to Christianity, but they're found in deism. So I am one of these people that acknowledges that America has been influenced by genuine Christianity, and I would say it has been influenced by deistic people. But if you are one of those people, like a lot of these woke folks say, that the story of the story of influence in Christianity is not actual Christianity, but therapeutic moralistic deism. That God just wound up the world like a clock to run itself. He's not actually in creation. This is one of the reasons they say is the reason why a lot of injustice has been perpetuated in America is because its roots were not about a God who is truly in creation and over creation, but a winding up clock God that's deistic. No, that's not true. America was influenced by deistic figures and actual Christianity. Okay, you probably don't know this, or maybe you don't accept this, but the reason why we have a government with separations of powers is because Americans, borrowed from our ecclesiology, Presbyterians. So we have a local authority, we have a regional authority, and then we have a national authority, separation of powers, interrelated courts, no hierarchy of power, no monogamy of power, but a decentralization of power. That does not come from deism, okay? That comes from a God who governs reality and existence according to his law and his truth. The idea that this place is governed by rule of law, not oligarchy, not aristocracy, constitutional government also comes from people that were influenced by Christians. Listen, Samuel Rutherford and Lex Rex, okay, and how he exposited authority and government and power in light of the scriptures. Those were things that inform people as to understand how the governed is governed by the consent of the governed and not by the tyranny of elites. So as I begin to say that, you begin to say, well, what about all the injustice and horrific things and awful things that happen in this place? Guess what? It's a fallen world full of fallen people that were inconsistent with their so-called ethics, and there's a mixture of complicated factors. So yes, the Christianity that genuinely influenced this particular place of the globe is wrought with inconsistency. It's wrought with a necessity for reformation and renewal. But America is not influenced by the totality of deism. It has genuine Christianity with inconsistencies all mixed in that influence it. Just in conclusion to this section, I think a lot of these people in this conversation can be at times misunderstood in certain situations. So let me just say this to some of you, maybe on the other side of the conversation. Application of theology is not necessarily being a socialized Christian, okay? Connecting the gospel to issues of ethnicity and certain communities and addressing things unique to your community is not the social gospel. So for you who get all bent out of shape when the black community or the brown community begin to discuss theology in lieu of their contextual distinctiveness. Some of you call yourselves Dutch Reformed. That was them working out theology in their context. Some of you, like myself, I am an American. I am a Cuban American, but I'm Scottish Reformed. That's where in the Scottish world where theology was worked out is where I understood. So, working out your theology in your context is not necessarily the social gospel. So be very careful with guys in certain ethnic settings wanting to be specific about how to apply the gospel and the law of God to those settings and calling that social gospel, CRT or whatever. You're confused or you're suspicious about that. However, a lot of stuff that is in this conversation of gospel application and urban apologetics, it is social gospel stuff. But the engagement of context with theology is not necessarily so. So just keep that in mind.